Do you remember those hearty country dinners that once filled every family table, but have all but vanished from memory? These were the meals made from simple ingredients, stretching every dollar while keeping bellies full and hearts warm. From bubbling stews to humble casseroles, each dish tells a story of frugality, ingenuity, and home-cooked comfort. Today, we're digging through old cookbooks to bring back 30 forgotten country dinners no one makes anymore. Chicken and dumplings. There's a reason chicken and dumplings is remembered with such fierce fondness across the American countryside.
Chicken and dumplings is a dish that I didn't grow up eating.
It wasn't just a meal, it was the edible embodiment of comfort. Born out of frugality, this dish thrived during the Great Depression and war years when a single bird had to stretch far enough to feed a family. Nothing was wasted. The backbone and scraps went into a simmering pot, producing a broth that could warm both body and soul. Flour, cheap and abundant, became dumplings that floated like soft pillows across the golden surface. Together, they created a meal that felt luxurious in spite of its humble origins. The ingredients list reads like a love letter to simplicity. Chicken, onions, carrots, celery if you had it, salt and pepper, maybe a bay leaf. The dumplings were little more than flour, fat, and milk stirred together into a sticky dough and dropped by spoonfuls into bubbling stock. There was no need for precision, no glossy cookbook photos to emulate, just a grandmother's practiced hand and the knowledge that nothing could go too wrong when flour met broth. But more than taste, it was the atmosphere that made chicken and dumplings memorable. Families gathered around chipped enamel bowls at farmhouse tables, steam curling upward, the dish warming not just bellies, but the mood of a room after a long day's labor. It was survival food elevated by love and ritual, an act of turning scarcity into abundance. Today, it's often overshadowed by rotisserie chickens from the supermarket or quick microwave dinners. Yet, when made from scratch, chicken and dumplings reminds us of a time when cooking was slower, heartier, and deeply personal. It's not just a forgotten country dinner. It's a reminder that comfort sometimes begins with nothing more than a pot, a bird, and a little patience. Meatloaf with oatmeal. If there was ever a dish that wore its practicality proudly, it was meatloaf with oatmeal.
Called country meatloaf. This is a recipe.
This wasn't the sleek, ketchup-glazed version that pops up on glossy food blogs. It was the sturdy, no-nonsense loaf that appeared on countless farmhouse tables in the mid-20th century. Ground beef was expensive, and every penny counted. So thrifty cooks turned to oatmeal not just as filler, but as a secret binder that stretched a pound of meat to feed 6 or 7 hungry mouths. What could have been meager turned into something hearty, satisfying, and strangely endearing. The beauty of this loaf was its economy of ingredients. Ground beef, rolled oats, maybe an onion, a splash of milk, an egg to hold it together, and if you were lucky, a slick of tomato sauce or ketchup over the top. Some families added Worcestershire or mustard powder for zing, but many relied on salt and pepper alone. The oatmeal disappeared into the mixture as it baked, lending a tender texture that made each slice soft but firm enough to sit proudly beside mashed potatoes or buttered beans. Preparation was straightforward. No measuring cups needed, just a mixing bowl, a steady hand, and the willingness to shape the mixture into a humble loaf. Once in the oven, it filled the house with the kind of smell that drew children in from the yard and made the kitchen feel like the center of the world. For many, meatloaf with oatmeal isn't just a dish. It's a memory of family dinners where thrift met creativity. Today, it's largely overlooked in favor of gourmet takes with exotic breadcrumbs or bacon lattices. But in its unadorned form, this loaf speaks volumes about resilience. It reminds us that stretching a meal wasn't shameful. It was a quiet triumph, baked golden brown in a battered pan. Liver and onions. Few country dinners divide opinion quite like liver and onions.
Liver and onions, y'all. Okay?
For some, it's the taste of childhood suppers at grandma's table, a dish rich in iron and nostalgia. For others, it's a memory of being told, "You'll eat what's on your plate," while staring down at a slab of organ meat that looked far too serious to be dinner. But love it or hate it, liver and onions held a firm place in rural kitchens for decades, born out of necessity and thrift. In an era when nothing from the animal went to waste, liver was considered a valuable cut, both affordable and nutrient-packed. Families who couldn't afford prime roasts or fancy steaks often turned to liver as a protein that delivered strength at a fraction of the cost. Onions, cheap and abundant, were its constant companion, sliced thin, browned in fat, and piled high to mellow out the liver's strong mineral flavor. A little flour for dredging, some butter or lard for frying, and perhaps a splash of gravy made the dish hearty enough to be called supper. The preparation was deceptively simple. Soak the liver in milk if you wanted to temper its intensity, dredge in flour, pan fry quickly to avoid toughness, then smother it with onions caramelized until sweet and golden. The aroma filled farmhouses, a mingling of earthiness and sweetness that clung to the walls long after dinner plates were cleared. What lingers most in memory, though, isn't just the taste, it's the sense of discipline and gratitude the dish carried. Liver and onions was never about indulgence. It was about respect for the animal, the dollar, and the effort it took to put food on the table. Today, it rarely appears outside of old diners or specialty butcher counters. But in its time, it was a dinner that reminded families to make do, eat well, and waste nothing. Salmon patties canned. Long before fresh salmon fillets became a weeknight staple in upscale kitchens, rural families were cracking open humble cans of salmon and transforming them into something that felt like a small luxury: salmon patties.
Make delicious salmon patties out of all that canned salmon.
In farmhouses and small-town kitchens, canned fish meant convenience, affordability, and a chance to serve seafood hundreds of miles away from the nearest ocean. These golden brown patties became a Depression-era darling and stuck around for decades as a quick, filling supper. The ingredient list was beautifully frugal. 1 can of salmon, bones and skin included, because nothing went to waste, mixed with breadcrumbs or crushed saltine crackers, an egg, a splash of milk, and sometimes a pinch of onion or parsley if the garden allowed. Formed into patties and fried in a hot skillet, they crisped up into little rounds that were equal parts savory and satisfying. A squeeze of lemon was optional but rarely available. Ketchup or tartar sauce filled the gap when pantries were more forgiving. Preparing them was as straightforward as it gets. Stir, shape, fry, and serve. For busy mothers and farmhands alike, the appeal was obvious. In less than half an hour, dinner was ready. One that carried enough protein to keep bellies full after a long day of work. Children often sat at the table with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, poking at the patties before realizing they were surprisingly tasty. Salmon patties carried a certain dignity, proving that thrift didn't have to mean dull. They were crispy on the outside, tender within, and versatile enough to sit alongside mashed potatoes, green beans, or simply a slice of bread. Today, they've fallen out of favor, overshadowed by glossy salmon fillets and trendy poke bowls. Yet there's something about cracking open that can and frying up those patties that still whispers of resilience, resourcefulness, and the quiet genius of turning pantry basics into dinner worth remembering. Slumgullion stew. With a name that sounds more like a frontier tall tale than a proper supper, Slumgullion stew was the ultimate everything but the kitchen sink meal.
Home canned minestrone soups.
It cropped up in pioneer camps, Depression-era kitchens, and even logging camps, where meat was scarce and appetites were enormous. The word itself dates back to the 19th century and loosely meant a hodgepodge, a mishmash, a pot of whatever you've got. And that's exactly what it was. A stew born from scraps, leftovers, and imagination. The base was usually whatever meat could be spared. Bits of beef, pork, or even wild game, cut into small pieces and browned for flavor. From there, the pot welcomed potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, beans, macaroni, or any vegetable threatening to wilt in the pantry. Flour or cornstarch thickened the broth, and seasonings were modest, often just salt and pepper. Some cooks added a splash of tomato sauce or ketchup for tang, while others swore by Worcestershire if a bottle happened to be hiding in the cupboard. It was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to stretch and satisfy. Cooking it was simple. Simmer it long and low until the vegetables softened and the flavors mingled. Served steaming hot in big bowls, Slumgullion stew was less about the recipe and more about the ritual. Each family had its own version, and no two pots ever tasted the same. One night it leaned heavy on potatoes, the next on beans or pasta, depending on what was around. The charm of Slumgullion lies in its spirit. It's a dish that laughs at scarcity, insisting that a meal can be made from odds and ends if you're willing to get creative. Today, it's largely vanished from dinner tables, replaced by meal prep kits and prepackaged soups. Yet in its heyday, this humble stew was proof that thrift, ingenuity, and a big pot could feed both stomachs and spirits. Ham and beans with cornbread. Few dinners capture the soul of country cooking quite like a steaming pot of ham and beans served alongside a golden skillet of cornbread. This pairing wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual that stretched across generations, born of necessity, yet remembered as comfort.
Southern ham and beans with cornbread.
In the lean days of the Great Depression and post-war years, families often relied on a humble ham hock or leftover bone to flavor a pot of dried beans. It was proof that even scraps could be transformed into something nourishing, hearty, and deeply satisfying. The ingredients were deceptively simple: a pound of dried navy beans, a meaty ham bone or a salty hock, an onion, and water. That was the foundation. Slow cooking over the course of an afternoon worked its quiet magic, softening the beans and infusing them with smoky, porky richness. Cornbread, meanwhile, was just cornmeal, flour, milk or buttermilk, an egg, and a spoonful of fat, baked until the edges browned and the crumb stayed tender. Together, the two created a balance of creamy and crumbly, savory and sweet. Preparation was as unfussy as the ingredients. The beans were rinsed, covered with water, and left to simmer with the ham bone until tender. The cornbread batter came together in minutes, poured into a sizzling, greased cast iron skillet that guaranteed a crisp crust. When the two were set on the table side by side, there was no mistaking it. This was a meal designed to feed hungry farmhands and families alike, stretching pennies without skimping on flavor. Beyond thrift, ham and beans with cornbread carried emotional weight. It was a dish of community, served at church suppers, potlucks, and kitchen tables where neighbors might drop in unannounced. Today, it may be overshadowed by flashier recipes, but in its simplicity lies a reminder that the most enduring dinners are often the ones that ask for little more than time, patience, and a hot skillet. Shepherd's pie, leftover roast version. Before freezer meals and pre-packaged casseroles took over, Country families had their own ingenious way of giving yesterday's roast a second life, shepherd's pie. Not the glossy, cheese-topped version you'll see on Instagram today, but the thrifty, no-waste dish that stretched a Sunday roast into Monday's dinner. In rural kitchens, where meat was precious and leftovers never went to waste, this pie was less about a strict recipe and more about a philosophy. Make do, use up, and feed everyone well. The foundation was simple. Bits of leftover beef or lamb, chopped fine or run through a hand-cranked grinder, became the hearty filling. Onions, carrots, and peas, sometimes fresh, often canned, were stirred in for bulk and color. Gravy from the roast was stretched with a little water or broth, creating a savory base to bind it all together. Then came the crowning glory, a thick layer of mashed potatoes, spread across the top like a warm blanket, ridged with a fork so it browned just right in the oven. Preparation was straightforward and forgiving. The meat and vegetables went into a baking dish, the gravy held everything together, and the potatoes sealed the deal. Into the oven it went until bubbling underneath and golden on top. It wasn't fancy, but when it hit the table, it felt like abundance reborn, proof that thrift could also mean comfort. For families, shepherd's pie was more than just another way to stretch meat. It was about continuity, the idea that Sunday's roast lingered into the week, carrying its flavor and its story forward. Today, it rarely appears outside of nostalgic cookbooks or family traditions, overshadowed by instant dinners and takeout. Yet there's something quietly beautiful about it. A meal built on yesterday's work, transformed into something new, hearty, and ready to gather everyone around the table once again. Tuna noodle casserole. If ever there were a dish that defined mid-century American frugality wrapped in creamy comfort, it was tuna noodle casserole. This was the meal that showed up in church basements, school potlucks, and weeknight family dinners when money was tight but bellies still needed filling. Born in the post-World War II era, when canned goods and convenience foods were king, it was a way to transform pantry staples into something that felt almost indulgent. With its creamy base, tender noodles, and crunchy topping, it became a symbol of practicality dressed up as comfort food. The cast of characters was modest and familiar. Egg noodles boiled until soft, canned tuna flaked into the mix, and a can or two of cream of mushroom soup to hold everything together. Milk stretched the sauce, peas or green beans added a splash of color, and saltine crumbs or crushed potato chips sprinkled on top gave it that irresistible crunch. Each ingredient was inexpensive and shelf-stable, making it a reliable choice when grocery budgets were lean. Preparation was as straightforward as the ingredients. Cook the noodles, stir them together with tuna, soup, and vegetables. Pour it into a casserole dish and bake until bubbly. That final moment, when the topping turned golden and crispy, was what elevated the dish from mere thrift to something downright comforting. Families could scoop it out in generous portions, and somehow there always seemed to be enough for seconds, or leftovers for the next day's lunch. For many, the memory of tuna noodle casserole is inseparable from the sound of a Pyrex lid clinking on a countertop, or the sight of mom pulling it out of the oven on a chilly night. Today, it's often dismissed as dated, overshadowed by fresher, lighter fare. Yet one bite is enough to transport you back to a time when simple pantry staples, mixed with care, could make a meal feel like a small feast. Beef tongue stew. Once upon a time, before supermarkets offered neatly trimmed cuts wrapped in plastic, cooks knew the value of every part of the animal. Beef tongue stew was one of those dishes that reminded families that thrift and respect went hand in hand. In rural kitchens and immigrant households alike, the tongue was not discarded. It was celebrated, simmered, and transformed into something tender and rich. While today it might make some diners raise an eyebrow, for earlier generations it was simply good sense. Why waste what could become a hearty supper? The ingredients were humble but clever. A beef tongue, boiled slowly until tender, became the star. Carrots, potatoes, onions, and celery joined in, stretched with broth and thickened into a stew that could easily feed a hungry family. Seasonings were simple: bay leaves, peppercorns, maybe a pinch of cloves if the spice tin allowed. Some recipes even added a splash of vinegar or tomato for brightness, cutting through the meat's richness. What resulted was a dish that was both nourishing and deeply satisfying. Preparation required patience but little skill. The tongue was first simmered until its tough outer skin could be peeled away. A task that may have turned young helpers squeamish, but was essential for tender meat. From there, the chunks of tongue were folded back into the pot, mingling with vegetables and broth until everything melded into a savory, aromatic stew. Served in wide bowls with bread to soak up the juices, it was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and left little waste behind. For families, beef tongue stew wasn't exotic. It was normal, part of a tradition of making the most of what you had. Today, it has largely disappeared from American dinner tables, overshadowed by more palatable cuts and convenience foods. Yet for those who remember, the dish carries a powerful message. Economy, respect, and ingenuity can turn even the humblest cut into a feast worth savoring. Chicken pot pie, homemade crust. Before frozen dinners lined supermarket freezers, chicken pot pie was not something you popped into the microwave. It was the crown jewel of country kitchens, made from scratch with patience, thrift, and a touch of pride.
Chicken pot pie is one of the best comfort dishes of all time. Let's make it.
The homemade crust alone told you everything you needed to know. Flaky, golden, and slightly uneven. A sure sign that it came from a rolling pin in a flour-dusted farmhouse, not a factory conveyor belt. For many families, this dish was both a way to stretch leftovers and a centerpiece hearty enough to bring everyone running to the table. The filling was born from practicality. Leftover chicken, usually from a Sunday roast, was shredded and folded into a mixture of carrots, peas, onions, and potatoes. The sauce was a creamy gravy, built from pan drippings or a quick roux with butter, flour, and milk. It was humble, yet rich, the kind of flavor that lingered on the tongue and in the memory. The crust sealed everything together, turning the mixture into a warm, bubbling package of comfort. Preparation required a steady hand and some faith. The dough had to be rolled just thin enough to bake through, but sturdy enough to hold the filling. Once assembled, the pie was slid into a hot oven until the top blistered into golden perfection. Its scent filling the kitchen with a promise of comfort after a long day's work. Cutting into that crust to reveal the steaming filling underneath was as satisfying as the meal itself. What made chicken pot pie unforgettable wasn't just its taste, but its symbolism. It was a meal of resourcefulness, a way to give leftovers new life while feeding the family with warmth and generosity. Today, we reach too easily for the frozen aisle version. But the homemade kind reminds us of a slower era when dinner was both sustenance and ceremony, baked under a crust of simple love. Cabbage and noodles, haluski. Cabbage and noodles, known in many Eastern European immigrant communities as haluski, is one of those dishes that doesn't try to impress. It simply fills, comforts, and lingers in memory. When immigrants settled in coal towns and rural stretches of Appalachia, they brought this thrifty peasant dish with them. adapting it to whatever ingredients were cheapest and most available. It quickly became a country supper staple, hearty, inexpensive, and deeply satisfying after a long day of labor. The ingredient list couldn't be simpler. A head of cabbage, sliced thin and browned in butter or lard until sweet and tender. Egg noodles, boiled until soft, folded into the cabbage with a little onion, salt, and pepper. That's it. No fancy spices, no elaborate garnishes, just a few pantry basics coming together in a skillet. Some families stretched it with bacon drippings or added sour cream for richness. But at its core, haluski remained a dish that proved good food didn't have to be complicated. Cooking it was quick and forgiving. The cabbage caramelized down, releasing its sweetness, while the noodles absorbed butter and seasoning until they became comfort food incarnate. Served in large bowls, it was a meal meant for scooping generously, each bite carrying both the humble flavor of cabbage and the soft chew of noodles. It wasn't flashy, but it was the kind of dinner that left everyone at the table full and content. The nostalgia of cabbage and noodles runs deep. It was a dish that reminded families of old country traditions while grounding them in new American soil. Today, it's rarely spotted outside of family cookbooks or Lenten church suppers, but it deserves remembering. At its heart, haluski speaks to the beauty of simple food, frugal, filling, and quietly celebratory of the everyday. One skillet, a head of cabbage, a handful of noodles, that was dinner and it was enough. Squirrel stew. Once a common sight in rural kitchens, squirrel stew has become one of those dishes whispered about more than eaten, half remembered as both necessity and tradition. For families who lived close to the land, hunting wasn't sport, it was survival. When chickens were too valuable for eggs and beef was too costly, a brace of squirrels brought home from the woods could mean the difference between an empty table and a hot supper. In many parts of the American South and Appalachia, this stew was as ordinary as chicken soup, a dish that carried the rhythm of the seasons and the hunt. The ingredients reflected both thrift and ingenuity. Freshly dressed squirrels cut into pieces, simmered slowly with onions, carrots, and potatoes, formed the backbone of the meal. A splash of vinegar or tomatoes might be added to brighten the broth, while flour or cornmeal thickened it into a hearty gravy. Herbs were minimal, salt, pepper, maybe a bay leaf, because the star was the meat itself, tender and rich when cooked low and slow. Served with biscuits or cornbread, it stretched far enough to feed a whole family gathered around a wooden table. Cooking squirrels required patience and a steady hand. After cleaning and cutting, the meat was browned for flavor, then left to simmer until it nearly fell off the bone. Some cooks swore by parboiling first to soften it, while others believed the secret lay in long, steady simmering. Either way, the result was a stew that warmed bellies and rewarded the hunter's effort. Today, the idea of squirrel stew may raise eyebrows or even laughter, but in its time, it represented resilience and respect for the land. Nothing was wasted, and every meal had a story. Though it has nearly vanished from American tables, it remains a reminder of a past when dinner depended on skill, resourcefulness, and a good shot in the woods. Fried bologna steaks. Before deli meats became synonymous with quick sandwiches, bologna was a working family's affordable protein, and sometimes it made the leap from bread filler to main course. Enter the fried bologna steak, a dish that proved you didn't need ribeye or pork chops to feel like you were eating something special. In small-town diners and countless farmhouse kitchens, thick slices of bologna, sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, were the centerpiece of suppers that were humble yet strangely indulgent. The steak part wasn't a joke. It was all about presentation and attitude. Instead of the thin sandwich slices we know today, You'd cut the bologna into slabs half an inch thick, sometimes scoring the edges so they wouldn't curl up like little sombreros in the pan. Toss them into hot bacon grease or a pat of butter, and soon the kitchen filled with the savory scent of smoky, crispy-edged bologna. Add fried onions, maybe a smear of mustard, and you had yourself a plate that felt hearty enough to rival any Sunday dinner roast. Preparation was almost laughably simple. Slice, fry, and serve. But what made it memorable was the way families built meals around it. Mashed potatoes on the side, green beans from last summer's canning jars, and maybe cornbread to round things out. Some folks drizzled a little gravy over the top, while others stacked it between slices of white bread for a hot bologna sandwich you couldn't eat without licking your fingers. Today, fried bologna steaks have nearly disappeared outside of nostalgic diners or TikTok experiments, but they embody a time when thrift and creativity defined dinner. It wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying, filling, and served with pride. For many, one whiff of sizzling bologna is enough to summon memories of simpler suppers where nothing went to waste and everything tasted better in a cast iron pan. Porcupine meatballs. Porcupine meatballs may sound like a creature from a whimsical storybook, but in mid-century American kitchens, they were a clever, practical dinner solution. The name comes from the tiny grains of rice that peek out of the meatballs as they cook, resembling the spines of a porcupine. Far from exotic, these meatballs were born out of frugality. Designed to stretch a pound of ground beef into enough food to satisfy a hungry family without skimping on flavor or heartiness, the ingredients were simple and budget-friendly. Ground beef or a mix of beef and pork formed the base, mixed with uncooked rice, an egg for binding, finely chopped onion, salt, and pepper. Some families added a splash of milk to soften the mixture, while others seasoned it with a little Worcestershire or mustard powder. The magic happened in the sauce, usually a tomato-based gravy that was poured over the meatballs in a casserole dish, then baked until the rice expanded and the flavors melded into a comforting, savory dinner. Preparation was straightforward but satisfying. The meat mixture was rolled into balls, nestled into the sauce, and baked slowly. As the meat cooked, the rice expanded, absorbing juices and seasoning, creating tender, flavorful morsels that were both filling and economical. Served alongside mashed potatoes, buttered green beans, or even simple bread, porcupine meatballs became a mainstay of weekday dinners across America. What makes this dish linger in memory isn't just the taste, it's the ingenuity. It's a testament to a time when stretching ingredients didn't feel like deprivation, but like resourcefulness. Today, porcupine meatballs may be largely forgotten, replaced by gourmet meatball recipes or pasta-centric meals. But in their heyday, they represented a dinner that was hearty, comforting, and lovingly practical. Proof that even the humblest ingredients could become something memorable. Victory Garden Vegetable Soup. Victory Garden Vegetable Soup is a dish steeped in history and ingenuity, born during World War II when families were encouraged to grow their own produce to supplement rationed groceries. These gardens, planted in backyards, schoolyards, and empty lots, were more than a hobby. They were a patriotic act. And from those humble rows of beans, carrots, cabbage, and tomatoes came a soup that nourished both body and spirit, turning simple vegetables into a meal that felt abundant even in lean times. The ingredients were whatever the garden yielded. Carrots, green beans, peas, tomatoes, onions, and potatoes formed the base, simmered gently in water or a simple broth. Salt, pepper, and perhaps a bay leaf were the only seasonings necessary. The vegetables themselves provided flavor, color, and sustenance. Leftover herbs from the windowsill or garden added extra depth when available, and if a family had a bit of meat or bacon, it was added sparingly to stretch the protein further. The goal wasn't sophistication, it was nourishment, thrift, and making every scrap count. Preparation was simple but intentional. Vegetables were chopped and added to a large pot, simmered slowly until tender, with flavors melding and thickening naturally. The result was a soup that could feed a family for days, eaten as a main meal with bread or as a starter before dinner. There was a rhythm to making it, a quiet satisfaction in watching the bounty of the garden transform into a warming, sustaining dish. Today, the concept of a victory garden soup feels almost quaint, replaced by pre-packaged soups or farm-to-table menus. Yet there's nostalgia and resilience in every bowl, a reminder that creativity and resourcefulness can turn even modest harvests into comfort and sustenance. It's a dish that whispers of history while still offering warmth to anyone willing to ladle it into a bowl and remember the care that went into growing and cooking it. Macaroni and tomatoes. Macaroni and tomatoes is the kind of country dinner that whispers thrift, simplicity, and quiet ingenuity. Popular during the Depression and lingering in mid-century kitchens, it was a way to feed a family without expensive ingredients, transforming pantry staples into a meal that felt warm, comforting, and oddly celebratory. It wasn't about luxury, it was about making do and making it delicious. The ingredients were minimal yet versatile. Dried macaroni boiled until tender formed the base, while canned or fresh tomatoes added both flavor and moisture. Onions, a pinch of sugar to balance acidity, and a splash of oil or butter rounded out the dish. For families with a little extra, a handful of grated cheese or sprinkle of herbs elevated the humble supper, though it was entirely satisfying without. Salt and pepper were the final touch, simple seasonings that let the tomatoes shine. Preparation was effortless, which only added to its appeal. The macaroni cooked first, then was folded into a tomato sauce, simmered on the stove until thickened and flavorful. Everything melded together into a warm, bright, and hearty dish that could stretch to feed everyone at the table. Leftovers were just as welcome the next day, often reheated with a little extra butter or cheese. What made macaroni and tomatoes memorable was its accessibility. It was a dish that could be made quickly, cheaply, and from ingredients that were almost always on hand. Families passed it down because it worked, filling, frugal, and adaptable. Today, it may seem modest compared to gourmet pasta dishes or elaborate casseroles, yet there's a reason it endured. Macaroni and tomatoes reminds us that comfort doesn't require extravagance. Just a pot, some noodles, and a little tomato love can turn a simple meal into a lasting memory. Cornbread and buttermilk supper. There's something quietly heroic about a simple supper of cornbread and buttermilk. It wasn't a meal for show, but for sustenance, hearty, humble, and deeply satisfying. In farmhouses across the rural United States, this pairing was a weekday staple, particularly during lean seasons when meat was scarce or the pantry needed to stretch a little farther. It exemplified the ingenuity of cooks who could turn just a few ingredients into something that filled bellies and lifted spirits. Cornbread, golden and slightly crumbly, was made from cornmeal, a bit of flour, an egg, milk or buttermilk, and a spoonful of fat. Baked in a cast iron skillet, its edges crisped while the center stayed soft and tender. The aroma alone drifting through the kitchen could summon the family from the fields or the schoolyard. Buttermilk, often kept on hand in glass jars from morning milking or local deliveries, was the perfect foil. Tart, cooling and soothing against the warm, slightly sweet bread. Together, they created a balance that was both nourishing and comforting. Preparation was straightforward, yet demanded care. The cornbread batter required just enough stirring to combine ingredients without overmixing, and the hot skillet needed a quick brush of fat to ensure the crust caramelized perfectly. Poured and baked, the bread developed a golden crust, a promise of a meal that required nothing more than simple attention and patience. This supper carried more than flavor, it carried tradition. Cornbread and buttermilk was a dish of economy and practicality, but it also spoke of family and rhythm. The quiet dinners after long days of work, when conversation flowed as freely as the milk. Though rarely the centerpiece of modern tables, it endures in memory, reminding us that sometimes the simplest meals are the most satisfying and the most enduring. Beef and barley stew. Beef and barley stew is the kind of country dinner that sticks to your ribs and lingers in memory long after the last spoonful. Rooted in rural kitchens and immigrant households, it was a practical solution for families who needed meals that could feed many without emptying the pantry. Cheap cuts of beef, slowly simmered with vegetables and barley, turned into a hearty, nourishing dish that felt like a warm embrace on a cold evening. The ingredients were simple but purposeful. Tough cuts of beef provided flavor and protein, while onions, carrots, and celery added sweetness and depth. Pearl barley, an inexpensive grain, absorbed the savory broth, thickening the stew naturally while giving each bite a satisfying chew. A few bay leaves, salt, and pepper were often all the seasonings needed, though some cooks added parsley or a splash of tomato for brightness. Every element was chosen to stretch resources while maximizing nutrition and comfort. Preparation was forgiving but deliberate. The beef was browned first to lock in flavor, then combined with chopped vegetables and barley in a simmering pot of water or stock. Hours of gentle cooking transformed the meat until tender and allowed the flavors to meld, creating a rich, aromatic stew. Served hot with fresh bread or cornbread, it became the centerpiece of a family dinner, nourishing not just bodies but spirits after a long day of work or school. Today, beef and barley stew may seem old-fashioned, often replaced by quick-cook recipes or pre-packaged meals. Yet it embodies a legacy of patience, thrift, and heart. Each spoonful tells a story of resourcefulness, of families making the most of simple ingredients, and of the quiet satisfaction that comes from a meal both humble and deeply satisfying. It's a dish worth remembering, if only to remind us that comfort often comes from the simplest of combinations. Venison roast. Long before grocery stores offered neatly trimmed roasts at predictable prices, venison roast was a mark of both skill and survival. Hunting was part of life in rural America, especially in forested areas where deer were abundant and meat could be scarce. A successful hunt meant more than a trophy. It meant a meal that could feed a family, often for days. Venison, lean and richly flavored, became a centerpiece of country dinners, embodying both resourcefulness and a connection to the land. The ingredients were minimal, letting the meat shine. A whole venison roast, trimmed of sinew, often seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and perhaps a few herbs like thyme or rosemary. Root vegetables, carrots, potatoes, onions, were added to the roasting pan to soak up the meat's juices, creating a one-pan dinner that was as practical as it was flavorful. Some cooks added a splash of broth or a little wine if available, but the focus remained on letting the venison speak for itself. Preparation required patience. The roast needed low, slow cooking to prevent the lean meat from drying out. As it cooked, the aroma of roasting meat and vegetables filled the kitchen, a signal that the family could gather around the table. Slicing into the tender meat and serving it alongside the softened vegetables was as much a ritual as it was a meal. Leftovers often became stew or sandwiches, ensuring nothing went to waste. Today, venison roast is more likely to appear at specialty gatherings or in the freezer of avid hunters than on the average dinner table. Yet, it holds a special place in the history of country cooking, representing resilience, skill, and the satisfaction of a meal earned through effort. In every slice, there's a story of connection to the land, to family, and to a time when resourcefulness defined the table as much as taste. Chipped beef on toast. SOS. Chipped beef on toast, affectionately nicknamed SOS, is a dish that perfectly captures mid-century thriftiness and the ingenuity of feeding a family on a budget. Originally popularized in military mess halls during World War II, it quickly made its way into American kitchens, offering a quick, filling meal that relied on pantry staples rather than fresh meat. For households balancing tight grocery budgets, this dish was a comforting solution, creamy, savory, and surprisingly satisfying despite its humble ingredients. The components were simple and shelf-stable. Dried or salted beef, thinly sliced and often pre-packaged, was the star. A roux of butter and flour, combined with milk, created a thick white sauce that softened the salty meat, making it spreadable over toasted bread. A touch of black pepper or a hint of mustard could elevate the flavor, but nothing elaborate was required. The key was in the simplicity, a filling meal built from minimal ingredients that could be assembled quickly. Preparation was quick and forgiving. The chopped beef was stirred into the hot white sauce until tender, then ladled generously over buttered toast. The result was a creamy, slightly salty, hearty plate that was ready in minutes. Perfect for busy families, farmhands, or anyone needing a fast, satisfying supper. Leftovers could be reheated for lunch, and the dish's portability made it a staple for school-age children's lunches as well. Though largely forgotten today, replaced by fancy sandwiches or convenience foods, chipped beef on toast remains a testament to practicality and resourcefulness. It wasn't glamorous, but it delivered sustenance with minimal effort, embodying a time when cooks made the most of what they had. In its creamy, salty simplicity, SOS tells a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet pride of transforming modest ingredients into a memorable meal. Amish Haystack Supper. The Amish Haystack Supper is a dish that embodies both community and creativity, turning modest ingredients into a vibrant, customizable meal. Originating in Amish communities in the Midwest, this dinner became a favorite for large gatherings, church socials, and family suppers, where feeding a crowd efficiently was just as important as flavor. It wasn't about frills. It was about bringing people together around a table piled high with layers of simple, satisfying food. At its core, the haystack is a base of crunchy tortilla chips or shredded lettuce, topped with seasoned ground beef or turkey. From there, the layers multiply. Grated cheese, beans, diced tomatoes, onions, olives, and any other fresh or canned toppings on hand. A drizzle of sauce, often a tomato-based chili sauce or creamy dressing, binds it all together, creating a tower of textures and flavors. The beauty of the dish is in its flexibility. Families used what they had, and every haystack looked a little different, yet all were equally hearty. Preparation is straightforward, relying on assembly rather than hours of cooking. The meat is browned and seasoned, toppings are chopped or shredded, and everyone builds their own plate. It's a meal designed for sharing, with each diner customizing portions to taste and appetite. This participatory style made the supper as social as it was satisfying, reinforcing community bonds while feeding hungry mouths. Today, Amish haystacks appear less frequently outside church gatherings or nostalgic cookbooks, but their legacy endures. They represent a time when practicality met abundance, when feeding a crowd didn't require expensive ingredients or complicated recipes. At its heart, the haystack supper reminds us that a meal is about more than sustenance. It's about connection, creativity, and the joy of sharing simple, well-loved ingredients with those around you. Hobo packets, foil dinners. Hobo packets, also known as foil dinners, are a shining example of ingenuity born from necessity. These simple meals became popular during the Great Depression, when families needed a portable, efficient way to cook over open flames or campfires. Farmers, workers on the move, and even children heading to summer camps relied on these packets to deliver a complete hot meal with minimal cleanup. What started as a survival technique became a beloved symbol of resourcefulness and rustic charm. The ingredients were whatever was on hand: small cuts of meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, and sometimes canned vegetables or leftover bits from the pantry. Everything was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and a dash of fat, then wrapped tightly in foil to create a self-contained cooking vessel. The foil trapped steam, allowing the ingredients to cook evenly while locking in juices and flavor. Some packets were even wrapped in leaves before foil became widely available, showing that the concept transcended materials. It was about efficiency, portability, and maximizing what was available. Preparation was surprisingly easy. Chop the ingredients, season, wrap, and place over hot coals in a campfire embers or an oven if cooking at home. Within 20 to 30 minutes, the packets transformed into steaming, tender meals, perfectly portioned for each diner. Opening the foil released a puff of savory aroma, a simple pleasure that announced the meal was ready. Today, hobo packets are mostly seen as a camping treat or nostalgic throwback, but they speak to a time when cooking was an exercise in creativity and resourcefulness. They remind us that even the humblest ingredients, carefully combined and thoughtfully cooked, could create a meal that was portable, nourishing, and satisfying. In every foil packet, there's a little history wrapped in practicality, and a taste of ingenuity that never goes out of style. Baked ziti country style. Long before baked ziti became a restaurant staple, the country-style version was a humble, comforting dish that made use of pantry staples and whatever cheese or sauce was on hand. In rural kitchens, it wasn't about fancy ingredients or elaborate techniques. It was about feeding hungry families with heart, flavor, and a touch of thrift. A bubbling casserole straight from the oven meant warmth, satiety, and the satisfaction of stretching simple ingredients into a crowd-pleasing meal. The base was straightforward: dried ziti or similar pasta, boiled until tender, layered with tomato sauce, canned or homemade, and generous portions of cheese, often a mix of whatever was available, like cheddar, mozzarella, or even a bit of cottage cheese. Ground beef or sausage might be added if affordable, or omitted entirely for a vegetarian version that still has a packed flavor. Seasonings were modest: garlic, onion, salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of dried herbs, relying on the combination of cheese, sauce, and pasta to carry the dish. Preparation was forgiving. Cook the pasta, mix or layer it with sauce, meat, and cheese, then bake until golden and bubbling. The aroma of tomato, melted cheese, and baked noodles filled the kitchen, calling the family to the table. Leftovers could be reheated without losing flavor, making it perfect for busy households or large gatherings. Baked ziti country style wasn't just about convenience, it was about making a little go a long way. Today, the dish is often overshadowed by gourmet casseroles or restaurant versions. But in its original form, it embodies the spirit of resourcefulness. It reminds us that a hot, cheesy casserole doesn't need extravagance to be memorable. Sometimes the simplest ingredients, combined with care and baked to perfection, are all that's needed to create a meal that warms both body and soul. Chicken a la king. Chicken a la king was the epitome of mid-century comfort and elegance rolled into one creamy, approachable dish. While today it may seem like a throwback from a bygone era, in the 1940s and 50s, it was a way to make everyday chicken feel special without breaking the bank. Families could turn leftover roasted or poached chicken into a luxurious meal with just a handful of pantry staples, proving that frugality and style could coexist on the dinner table. The ingredients were simple but indulgent in combination. Tender pieces of chicken were folded into a rich, velvety sauce made from butter, flour, and milk or cream. Sliced mushrooms, pimientos, and sometimes peas added texture and color, while a splash of sherry or a pinch of paprika provided subtle sophistication. Traditionally, it was served over buttered toast, rice, or egg noodles, allowing the creamy sauce to coat every bite. The result was hearty, comforting, and visually appealing, a far cry from plain chicken but still accessible for families on a budget. Preparation was straightforward yet satisfying. The sauce was made first, gently thickened to just the right consistency. Then the chicken and vegetables were stirred in, warming through before plating. It was a dish that didn't demand hours in the kitchen but rewarded care and attention with layers of flavor. The creamy sauce, tender chicken, and colorful vegetables created a plate that felt celebratory, even if the ingredients were humble. Today, chicken a la king may feel quaint or nostalgic, largely replaced by modern casseroles and contemporary twists on creamy chicken dishes. Yet it remains a reminder of a time when cooks transformed simple ingredients into something comforting, elegant, and memorable. It's a dish that whispers of home, ingenuity, and the art of making a little chicken feel like a feast fit for company. Pork chops with apples and onions. Pork chops with apples and onions is the kind of country dinner that balances sweet, savory, and rustic charm in every bite. In rural American kitchens, it was a popular way to stretch a simple cut of meat into a flavorful, memorable supper. This dish highlights the ingenuity of cooks who relied on seasonal produce, modest ingredients, and a knack for pairing flavors that complemented each other perfectly. It was as much about making a meal satisfying as it was about celebrating the harvest from orchards and gardens alike. The ingredients are refreshingly simple: bone-in pork chops, sliced apples, onions, a bit of butter or oil, and basic seasonings such as salt, pepper, and a pinch of cinnamon or brown sugar if available. The apples provide natural sweetness, the onions caramelize to bring out their savory depth, and the pork chops deliver hearty protein that feeds a family without extravagance. Even a simple drizzle of pan juices over the meat and fruit can turn the dish into a fragrant, homey delight. Preparation is straightforward but relies on timing. Pork chops are seared first to lock in juices and develop a golden crust, then removed while the apples and onions cook slowly in the same pan. As the fruit softens and the onions caramelize, the chops return to the pan to soak up the mingling flavors. The result is tender, flavorful meat, punctuated by the gentle sweetness of apples and the savory richness of onions, a harmony of tastes that feels both comforting and elevated. Today, this dish is less common on modern tables, overshadowed by faster or trendier recipes. Yet pork chops with apples and onions endures as a reminder of resourcefulness and simplicity, where seasonal produce and basic pantry staples combine to create a meal that's hearty, nostalgic, and deeply satisfying, a true reflection of country cooking at its finest. Succotash with salt pork. Succotash with salt pork is a dish that embodies the ingenuity of early American kitchens, where thrift, seasonality, and flavor came together in a simple, hearty meal. Traditionally a staple of southern and mid-Atlantic homes, it combined the vegetables of the season, corn, lima beans, and sometimes tomatoes or peppers, with salt pork, transforming humble ingredients into a dish that was both filling and flavorful. In times when fresh meat was scarce, salt pork added richness and protein, allowing families to stretch their provisions without sacrificing taste. The ingredients are straightforward yet satisfying. Fresh or frozen lima beans and sweet corn form the backbone, their natural sweetness balanced by the saltiness of small cubes of cured pork. Onions, bell peppers, and sometimes tomatoes add depth and texture. The pork renders its fat slowly as it cooks, coating the vegetables with a savory, silky sheen that turns the simple mix into a cohesive, flavorful dish. Seasoning is minimal, salt and pepper often suffice, but the combination of pork and vegetables creates layers of flavor that need no embellishment. Preparation is uncomplicated. The salt pork is cut into small pieces and cooked gently until it releases its fat. Then onions and peppers are added, followed by beans and corn. Simmering until tender allows the flavors to meld while keeping the vegetables distinct and vibrant. The result is a dish that is rustic, colorful, and comforting, served alone or alongside bread or potatoes to make a full meal. Though less common today, replaced by convenience foods or purely vegetarian succotash, succotash with salt pork remains a testament to culinary resourcefulness. It's a dish that celebrates seasonal vegetables, the art of making every ingredient count, and the simple pleasure of a hearty, well-balanced country meal. In every bite, it tells a story of frugality, flavor, and the quiet satisfaction of home cooking. Cabbage soup, poor man's stew. Cabbage soup, often called poor man's stew, is a dish that exemplifies thrift, simplicity, and sustenance rolled into one humble pot. Born in kitchens where every ingredient counted, it became a staple during hard times. From the Great Depression to post-war rationing, providing nourishment and warmth without requiring expensive cuts of meat or elaborate pantry staples. Its beauty lies in its ability to stretch modest ingredients into a filling, flavorful meal. The ingredients are straightforward: cabbage, onions, carrots, and potatoes form the base, simmered gently in water or a simple broth. Some households added a few beans, a ham hock, or bacon for richness, but the soup remained hearty even when purely vegetarian. Salt, pepper, and perhaps a bay leaf were often the only seasonings, allowing the natural sweetness and texture of the vegetables to shine. It was a dish that could fill a pot and feed an entire family no matter the season. Preparation was forgiving. Chop the vegetables, bring them to a simmer in the stock or water, and cook until tender. The cabbage softens and melds with the other ingredients, creating a thick, savory, aromatic broth that warms from the inside out. It was the kind of meal that improved if left to sit for a few hours, giving flavors time to marry and deepen. Served with cornbread or a slice of rustic bread, it became more than just a soup. It was a full supper. Though largely forgotten today, overshadowed by more exotic soups and ready-made convenience options, cabbage soup endures in memory and tradition. It is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the ability to turn humble, inexpensive ingredients into a meal that nourishes both body and spirit. In every bowl, there's a story of practicality, comfort, and the quiet pride of stretching what little you have into something sustaining and satisfying. Pot roast with root vegetables. Pot roast with root vegetables is the quintessential comfort dinner of country kitchens, a meal that evokes the aroma of slow-cooked meat filling the house and the sense of gathering around a warm table. In rural homes in mid-century America, it was a reliable centerpiece for Sunday dinners or special occasions, transforming a modest cut of beef into a tender, flavorful feast with the help of humble, earthy vegetables. It exemplifies the art of turning simple, affordable ingredients into a meal that feels abundant and nourishing. The ingredients are straightforward: a beef roast, carrots, potatoes, onions, and sometimes parsnips or turnips, all simmered together in broth or water. Seasonings were minimal: salt, pepper, a bay leaf or two. But the magic came from slow cooking, which allowed the meat to become tender and the vegetables to soak up its savory juices. The result was a hearty, fragrant meal where every bite carried the rich depth of flavors developed over hours of gentle heat. Preparation required patience. The roast was typically seared first to lock in flavor, then placed in a heavy pot with chopped vegetables and a splash of liquid. Covered and cooked low and slow in the oven or on the stove top, the meat became fork tender while the vegetables absorbed the savory broth. By the time it was ready, the kitchen smelled of caramelized onions, roasted meat, and sweet root vegetables, signaling a meal that could feed a family generously. Today, pot roast may seem old-fashioned, replaced in some kitchens by quicker meals or convenience foods, but its appeal endures. It represents not only culinary resourcefulness, but also the comfort of tradition, the satisfaction of a slow-cooked dinner, and the simple pleasure of a meal that nourishes both body and soul. Pot roast with root vegetables is timeless proof that patience and care can turn modest ingredients into a feast. Shoe fly pie and beans. Shoe fly pie and beans is a pairing that harks back to simpler times, rooted in Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens where frugality and flavor walked hand in hand. Shoe fly pie, a molasses-based treat, was originally a dessert for farmhands and travelers, named for the flies attracted to its sweet, sticky top. Paired with a hearty pot of beans, this combination created a meal that was both filling and comforting, demonstrating the ingenuity of rural cooks who could turn humble ingredients into satisfying dinners. The pie itself was simple yet rich in flavor. A basic crust encased a filling of molasses, brown sugar, and eggs, sometimes thickened with a touch of flour or breadcrumbs. Baked until the top was golden and slightly crackled, the result was a sticky, sweet pie with deep caramel notes, perfect for a forkful between bites of savory beans. The beans, often pinto or navy, were cooked slowly with a bit of salt pork, molasses, or brown sugar, creating a savory, sweet base that complemented the pie. This contrast of flavors made the meal surprisingly balanced and hearty. Preparation was straightforward but required patience. The pie batter could be mixed in minutes, while beans simmered gently over hours, absorbing the seasoning and developing richness. When served together, families had a meal that stretched ingredients, warmed the home, and satisfied both sweet and savory cravings. Shoe fly pie and beans wasn't fancy, but it was practical, delicious, and emblematic of a culinary tradition that valued thrift and ingenuity. Though largely forgotten today, replaced by modern desserts and quick-cooked beans, this pairing reminds us of a time when simplicity didn't mean sacrifice. Shoe-fly pie and beans was a meal of resourcefulness, warmth, and comfort, a testament to how modest ingredients, skillfully combined, could create a memorable country supper. And there you have it, 30 forgotten country dinners that once graced family tables, but have largely faded from memory. From hearty stews to simple vegetable dishes, these meals remind us that comfort, creativity, and frugality can come together in every bite. If any of these dishes brought back memories or sparked your curiosity, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe so we can keep celebrating these timeless recipes together. Which one would you love to try on your table? Let us know in the comments.